Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 8th of April 2024. Really appreciate you choosing to spend your time with me to get your Ukraine news fix. Well, we'll start with the military aid and equipment segment. Hopefully my videos have somewhat more success than they did yesterday, where 60% of my videos yesterday, I did 5 videos, 3 of them were restricted. It really frustrates me when YouTube do that. Anyway. That's why I always say like, subscribe, and share, so you can overcome the algorithm when the algorithm is often against you. Which reminds me, 40,000 subscribers is an arbitrary number. So let's say it's amazing, 39,642 subscribers. It's always what I wanted. Thank you for helping me to reach more and more people. It's really good stuff. Anyway, Greece may transfer more than 30 F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, according to Newsbreak media source. According to the portal, Greece is preparing to sell 108 fighter jets to be scrapped, which were going to be scrapped. So this is right. Rewind. There, I presume because the US is selling them F-35s and is doing a military not a military aid package. They are getting a bunch of equipment to Greece under the proviso that Greece would get rid of all of their Soviet era equipment to Ukraine. And so we had this delay of the US equipment getting there, and eventually Greece went, "Yep, okay, that's going to happen," and that is really great because there's an awful lot of stuff like Soviet era air defense systems and the missiles that go with them that Ukraine are going to get hold of by the looks of it. I think Greece could be an absolutely massive source of equipment for the Ukrainians over the coming months in a way that isn't like an official package of here stuff, but I think we're going to see stuff ending up in Ukraine that has come from Greece and Cyprus. Now, with that, they also said we're going to get rid of our highly diverse set of airframes, or not highly, but we've got too many types of airframes that we're operating. We want to just get it down to a more manageable couple of airframes. So we're going to get rid of, it turns out, a bunch of F-16s. And of course, Ukraine are very much wanting F-16s. And the idea is that they're going to sell them to, well, I'm not quite sure exactly what's going to happen. I presume that these are going to be sold to Ukraine. Where Ukraine gets some money from and how that deal is sorted out, I don't know. But according to the portal, they're preparing to sell 108 of these jets, of which 32 F-16C D Block 30 aircraft are likely to be transferred to Ukraine. That word transferred is doing a lot of heavy lifting. So often, when we talk about military aid packages, sometimes they are military aid being sold to Ukraine. Ukraine are buying them, but then the question is where they're getting the money from. Is that coming from international aid? So it's all kind of some kind of cyclical thing anyway. Right, so really, possibly really very good news there for the Ukrainians, and again, Greece being behind that, where, you know, Greece are one of the nations that have for a long time spent the requisite amount of money on their defence to qualify for NATO membership. And that's because of their always on tenterhooks with Turkey. But actually, they've been fairly slow in supporting Ukraine bilaterally, and they have been waiting to get replacements before giving some of the old stuff or getting the old stuff to Ukraine. So I think they gave a number of BMP-1s some time ago. But again, that was waiting for much newer replacements coming through from other Western nations. So it's really good news that they appear to be very much on board with bilateral assistance now, although arguably because they're getting other stuff in still. So anyway, good news nonetheless for Ukraine. Now, KNDS, the French military industrial concern, intends to increase production to 100% of the current rate within 12 months. So that's next to KNDS should be able to produce 144 Caesar guns per year. So we've talked previously about how they've gone up from 2 a month to 6 a month, and they're going to go up from 6 a month to 12 a month, I believe. When 12 times 12 is indeed 144. The commitment by KNDS, quote, will show the ability to respond to the needs of Ukraine, but also to all European partners who are members of NATO who are in the process of achieving their 2% of GDP investment in defence. So this is providing Caesars to other countries as well. We know that Denmark, for example, bought a load of, or ordered a load of Caesars before the war, I presume, and then they said to to France, to next to KNDS, can you make sure that they just go straight to Ukraine, and we don't actually need them? And in fact, Denmark has now subsequently said, in fact, all artillery and artillery ammunition of Denmark needs to be in Ukraine. There's no point us having it and not using it when Ukraine are fighting the battle that we would have to fight anyway. So they've taken the lead on that kind of approach, and that's fantastic. Now, sticking with France, quote, each information offensive against France follows French announcements of support for Ukraine. So the delivery of Scout missiles, Macron's statement on the possibility of sending French soldiers to Ukraine, the bilateral security agreement signed with Kyiv. Moscow responds each time with a destabilization operation. The Kremlin does not appreciate the strengthening of France's pro-Ukrainian position, especially at a time when Western aid is becoming a crucial issue for the Ukrainian resistance. I think France is now one of the main supporters of Ukraine, and they are therefore getting an awful lot of attention from Russian cyber warfare efforts. Quote, it remains to be seen how far this rise in tensions will go. In this respect, the Paris Olympics this summer are crystallizing fears. Knowing that a terrorist threat hangs over the 2024 Olympics, Moscow could decide to increase fears in order to sabotage the event and damage France's image. And of course, if they're only going to have their athletes turn up as under neutral flags and whatnot, then they aren't that interested in seeing the Olympics be a success at all, Russia. We can expect them to be really getting involved in both disinformation and cyber warfare with regard to the Olympics, and just outright, maybe even, I don't know, supporting terrorist activities that might be at play. John Ridge here talking to this idea that some people are a bit taken back when Zelensky says he wants 25 Patriots. As some people, I think, reacted to say, really? Like that many? I mean, goodness me, you're asking an awful lot, aren't you? John Ridge says, not sure why people are so flustered by Zelensky's comments. This is a realistic assessment of Ukraine's long-term requirements for the strategic air missile defense assets. They need to eventually replace at least as many S-300P batteries. We make new Patriot batteries and interceptors. They aren't some lost form of technical artisanship. Provided funding can be secured, this is an entirely reasonable acquisition objective over a 5 to 10 year period. And this is in response to someone saying 25 complete Patriot systems is 2.5 times the number Germany has in service and close to half the number of Patriot systems in active US service. He goes on to talk somewhere else about, I don't know if it's here, but talked about how they were back in the Cold War era. There was an awful lot of Patriot systems that were was it given to Germany or something that's along this similar sort of line. So this is not unprecedented. Anyway, I couldn't find what I was looking for after 20 minutes of looking, so I'll move on. So Jane Kiev here reporting that there is no level of Ukrainian society not engaged in some form of drone production or acquisition. Here, another 600 are handed over like it's nothing. This is something I've talked about before, which is there are these various claims, right, that the Russians are constructing X number of drones a month, and the Ukrainians are saying, well, we're up to 30,000 a month, 50,000 a month, whatever it is. And what you try and do is say, right, okay, what are the claims? And then what do we see on the front line? And does the data on the front line match what the claims are in terms of production? Because you wouldn't think they're just going to sit on drones that they're producing, stack them in a warehouse and not use them. And therefore, your production might be 300,000 a month, but actually you're only getting 10,000 to the front line because, why not keep them all in a warehouse? So that's obviously a bit nonsense. So you'd expect them to be used on the front line. Okay, maybe you don't have enough trained operatives, then that could cause a bit of an issue. But what we're not seeing with the data is that the Russians are using drones at a greater rate than the Ukrainians. It looks like the data is still in favour of the Ukrainians at the moment, or in fact increasingly so. And we see the use of night vision drones starting to overtake in terms of Ukrainian to Russian usage. Now, on top of all of that mix, we also, those are generally like those figures released, we are producing 50,000 drones a month or whatever it is, that the Ukrainians will say will be largely based or maybe entirely based on the construction of drones within defense manufacturing and within procurement from other nations. But there's this huge component of drone procurement that is within a voluntary sector, either people making them at home or volunteer units or organizations getting together and making these drones. And I don't know how much that is factored into numbers that are given. I don't know that you can possibly even do that when drone units or different military units are appealing for charitable donations and are buying these drones almost, you know, independently themselves. Not almost, they are. They appear to be saying, right, we're going to do some fundraising for this amount of money, and we're going to get a drone from here. Is that being factored into? And Ukraine is producing 50,000 drones a month. I doubt it is. And so, here we have 600 drones. Is this part of those overall statistics on drones? And the question then is, well, if the Ukrainians are doing this regularly, what are the Russians doing themselves? Are there Russian volunteer organizations and volunteers all around Russia who are producing drones? Well, yes, to some degree. Are they doing it to the same degree that Ukrainians are doing it? And what are we looking at statistically? And again, it's so difficult to know that we really have to go and then look at the front lines and see, well, what's the usage like? What's the data that we're getting? And what does it suggest? And it suggests that the Ukrainians are outproducing the Russians in drones, or at least they're out using them, and that's the important part, right? Okay, foreign partners allocate over, and sorry, just to go back to that, there are still, lots of people who tell you on the front line there will be unit commanders who say, yeah, the Russians have a massive advantage over us here, but of course that's localized areas, different units and different armies will have different perceptions of what's going on. And again, even because I was wondering about this recently, whether a battalion commander saying Chasiv Yar, so Greg was telling me that battalion commander in Chasiv Yar is saying, yeah, the Russians have got a drone advantage over us, and that could well be the case. I think the Russians were using quite a lot of drones in the area, certainly at the time he was making that claim. But I was also wondering, well, does a battalion commander actually have a really good handle on how many units are under him? How many units are using drones, and how many drone operators they have, and whether they are embedded or separate units, and would he know just quite how many drones are being used a day? Like, does he know that, okay, we've got this drone unit and they have like 20 drones stored in their dugout, and they're just going out and they're using them, and they're actually using 7 drones a day or something like that, right? Does he have the handle on those figures? He's going to get reports coming back to him of the absolute nuisance that Russian drones are causing to his troops, right? He's going to get a lot of negative reporting about, oh my goodness, it's terrible out there, drones are everywhere, the Russians are using drones. But does he likewise know how terrible it is for the Russians out there on the other side of the valley, or whatever it may be? He'll get reports coming back saying, yeah, we've destroyed 17 APVs and 6 tanks and this and that. But okay, would he know how much of that was down to drones? How many of those troops are down to drones? So I can envisage a situation where a battalion commander, that's in charge of an awful lot of stuff going on, might not have an accurate understanding of whether his side has a greater use of drones than the other side. He might have this idea that the opposition is using drones much more effectively, in a much more widespread manner than his own side is, but that might itself not be accurate, because I think there's so many moving parts going on. Just knowing how many drones are being used when every freaking one is using drones, I think that's really challenging. So, I didn't want this to be an issue between Greg and myself, but when Greg was like, no, definitely the Russians are using more drones than the Ukrainians, I'm like, yeah, I don't know, the data doesn't support that. And even if you're hearing that from the horse's mouth in certain areas, A, that's not extrapolatable, and B, it might not even be accurate from a battalion commander's point of view. Like, you'd think that they'd have an accurate handle on the situation, but actually I'd imagine that's really difficult with drones. Like, everyone's constructing drones in their own dugouts, putting them together, fixing them, getting them out, getting drones sent in, units are getting them, they get procurement centrally. There's drones just going everywhere, and then they're all going up and all being used, and stuff's getting blown up, and it's just data all over the shop. And it might be that someone like Andrew Perpetua's team in Tochny have the best handle on that by just looking at all the footage that's coming out, with all the weaknesses that have, with selection bias and footage not being uploaded, and who uploads the most footage and the least footage, and is that a difference between the two armies? But you know, that's at least empirical data. Anyway, I'm gone off on one there. Right, foreign partners allocate over $700 million for demining in Ukraine. Foreign partners have allocated that, and that's come from the Reintegration Ministry, reporting that yesterday. The US, Switzerland, Norway, EU countries, and Japan are among the key donors. The coalition for demining includes 20 countries. So that's really good news. It's super important for getting the country back online and for safety, both for safety and lives and the economy. The Ministry of Energy, and also like doing war as well, like they'll need to demine areas where they're operating in, so safety for the soldiers, not just civilians. The Ministry of Energy of Lithuania has offered to disassemble its closed thermal power plants into spare parts and transfer the equipment to the needs of Ukraine. This was stated by the Minister of Energy for Ukraine, Herman Halishchenko. That's really good news. So a power plant that's no longer being used might offer all sorts of goodies for the Ukrainians who are struggling to keep their power plants open and operational. Right, moving on to geopolitical stuff. French billionaire Javier Niel's investment company NJJ Capital will acquire two telecom businesses in Ukraine: fixed telecom and pay TV provider Data Group Volia, and LifeCell, Ukraine's third largest mobile operator. Following regulatory approval, the total value of the acquisition, including the purchase price and investment, is expected to be over $1 billion. The acquisitions are the first major investments in Ukraine by a new market player since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. This is, on the one hand, really good news. Like, inward investment into Ukraine is brilliant. Money flowing into Ukraine from outside Ukraine is good. That's new money coming in, boost the economy. What I would be worried about, I just don't know enough about it in this situation, is I would hope that outside investors aren't coming in, looking at cheap assets, buying them up and asset stripping them, and taking advantage of the precarious situation that Ukrainian corporations and companies and entities are in. I hope that's not the case. I hope this is just good inward investment, seeing money flow into Ukraine. Speaking of Europe, though, this is coming from Thierry Schmidlin. So thanks, Thierry, mate, for putting this together. Of course, this is just another person giving me data. So take it with a pinch of salt. Like I haven't verified this, is what I'm trying to say. But I was talking about the success Russia has had in sowing disinformation and in whipping up disunity in European political landscapes, particularly in France, where National Rally has gained a lot of support. And I think it's being their message is being amplified by Russia, and I think they have probably Russia to thank for it, to some degree, for their success. So the question is, what's it looking like in France at the moment? Because I've been worried about the European elections coming up in June for the members of the European Parliament, and if the far right in Europe, which is more nationalistic and more EU skeptical, so more about taking your country and taking it out of the EU, and less likely to support Ukraine, and all those things appear to be the case. Where are we looking at being in the EU after those June elections? Will there be far less support for Ukraine? I'm super worried about this. So he has sent me the latest polling, I presume, for the French European elections, if you like. So RN, which is Le Pen's, translates as National Rally, Rassemblement National, I think it is, 30 to 31%. Now, there's a huge proportion across a lot of parties in France vying for those elections. To get 30 to 31% is pretty much double the next party. That is massive. Reconquête, which is Maréchal's far-right party, getting 6 to 7%. And Patriote, which is Philippot, which is also far-right, getting between 0.5% and 1.5%. So you add that together, and the far-right and really the far-right, so I would put National Rally as a far-right, even though they've tried to temper their views to become more accessible and more appealing to the general public. So you see this quite often, which is a reinvention of far right parties until they get to a point where the larger electorate go, oh, you're acceptable now. So you had the National Front getting reinvented, then they changed their name, and it's Rassemblement National, and then Marine Le Pen has kind of softened her views and the rhetoric in certain areas to be more appealing, and now they're in this sweet spot where they are honing in on people's discontent with things like immigration and cultural issues within France, and then they're getting a lot of youth vote as well, which is interesting because traditionally the youth vote go more idealistic and left wing. Often, well, here in France is not seems to be not the case, and so you've got now 36 to and a half to 39 and a half, almost 40% far right French support in the European elections. That blows my mind, and it is massively threatening because France are the central pillar of the EU with Germany, and now the UK is not there for sure. And you have this, you have Macron being so strong on Ukraine, but in the domestic electorate, that is a struggle. So his own party is getting 16.5 to 18%. The Republican, the centre right party, which is EU, as Thierry says, EU compatible, is 6.5 to 7.5%. I presume that's um, old. What's his name? I keep wanting to say Sikorsky. Sarkozy. That was it. I kept thinking Quelqu'un m'a dit and his wife, an amazing song. Anyway, that's a digression. So, Place Publique, Socialist by the looks of it, 11 to 13%. Then you got the Greens, 6 to 7%. LFI, which is far left, Mélenchon, I think that's his party, 6.5 to 8.5%. Communists, 2.5 to 3%, and the rest are too small to look at. But the point is that you've got a lot of people voting for EU skepticism, and a lot of people voting, and that could be for the far left as well. So the LFI, I think, are not up for aiding Ukraine. I might be wrong on that, so correct me if I'm wrong. And possibly the communists who are also EU skeptical. So both of those are EU skeptical, but from the left. In the UK, when we had Brexit, that was called Lexit, which was left wing anti EU. Because the EU is this big contradiction of being a neoliberal trade bloc, essentially, which is why it's really interesting when people who are all against like regulation and looking at being sort of libertarian, actually, quite a lot of the rationale for the EU is neoliberal, uh, you know, classic economic liberalism there. So anyway, so you can get a left wing that's anti that, and you can then get the right wing who are anti that because they don't like immigration and free movement of people. And so in the end, is it just a kind of a bit of a contradiction in terms? Anyway, again, I digress. The issue here is that the status quo of where the EU is at the moment and their support, the strong support for Ukraine, is going to be under threat. Okay. And yet here we have Geert Wilders, and this is one for my good old Brexit friends out there. So people who are leavers. I was a Remainer. I debated publicly in Bournemouth twice on the subject of Brexit. Right, a bit tongue in cheek. This I know. People. I know many of you are dyed in the wool leavers and are happy that we came out of the EU. However, Geert Wilders, who is the anti-EU far right nationalist who got the biggest set of votes in the recent Dutch elections, has come out and said he's publicly abandoned the policy of the Netherlands leaving the EU, Nexit. We see from Brexit that all countries are better off within the European Union. The British showed us the consequences of leaving. Ouch. Like, this guy was held up as quite a, not a hero of EU skepticism because there's a lot of baggage with this guy, but he was a guy that that leavers in the UK sort of look to for kind of confirmation of their own desires to leave the EU, now saying, yeah, well, look at what happened to the UK. Their economy's a bit screwed as a result of leaving. We wouldn't want to be them, so we're going to change course. So that's really interesting. And actually, I think this has happened. This is kind of linked to Ukraine, because there is this understanding that possibly where Marine Le Pen for the French now National Rally used to be totally anti-EU and wanted to leave EU. Now they realise that leaving EU is probably not a good thing, and so it's about staying in the EU but changing the EU from within, which is what I used to argue we should have done by staying in the EU as the UK. Anyway, French aid to Ukraine here says Ukraine must win this war. If Ukraine loses this war, we all lose. He's not saying this. This is actually what's being said by the British and French together. So the cost of not supporting Ukraine today will be far greater than the cost of pushing Putin back. He's referring to this article that the UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron and the French Foreign Minister Stéphane Séjourné have written in the article. Quote, "We are both absolutely clear. Ukraine must win this war. If Ukraine loses, we all lose. We can rally others to join us in overcoming, and that the Allies must do even more to ensure defeat of Russia." This is really good news, as French aid to Ukraine says. France and the UK will jointly reiterate their steadfast support for Ukraine at the summit of the European Policy Community in Blenheim Palace in July, and they'll both proud of their support for Ukraine, from unprecedented sanctions to coordinated deliveries of the first Scalp and Storm Shadow long-range missiles. Just last month, the first Ukrainian pilots completed their training in the UK and began training in France as part of a program to strengthen Ukraine's ability to fly the F-16. So France and UK actually standing quite strong and together on approaches to Ukraine. So even though UK has come out of the EU in terms of Brexit, we are working very closely with the EU in terms of supporting Ukraine. Foreign Secretary David Cameron will then go to Washington to lobby Republican lawmakers for that $60 billion plus of military aid to Ukraine that's stalled since October. Cameron's visit reportedly comes ahead of a meeting with Mike Johnson this week. I am quite sceptical that he will have any success in convincing Johnson away from whatever he's planning on doing anyway. I think that is, no one's going to go, oh, okay, now that the Foreign Secretary from the UK has told me, I'm going to change my mind. He's concerned about his job, Mike Johnson. He's concerned about what Trump thinks of him. And so there are all those dynamics that I don't think Cameron will be able to touch. Nonetheless, thanks for going. And it raises the awareness among the general public. So if he gets to go on TV, on Fox News, particularly places like that, and advocate for support for Ukraine, it's that kind of work that I think David Cameron can do really well. Now, the US House is set to reconvene, and all eyes are on House Speaker Mike Johnson. Will he put Ukrainian aid up for a vote while Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene threatens to force a vote on his ouster? Johnson vowed to focus on Ukraine right after the recess. I did a piece yesterday in my Geopolitical video on Christian nationalism and evidence, looking at that and how it plays with support for Putin in terms of his approach to traditional values. A few people called me up on this. Someone said, you shouldn't invent Christian nationalism. Just to let you know, Christian nationalism is an established social political term. All you need to do, let's do that now. Let's go and pump into, in this case, it's not as good as Google, but we'll put Christian nationalism in, and you will see there are all sorts of fascinating articles on it. Here. So first of all, there's an entire Wikipedia page. Then what is Christian nationalism exactly? New York Times. What is Christianity Today? What is Christian nationalism? Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica, Christian nationalism. So BBC, Christian nationalists wanting to put God into the US government, so on and so forth. So this is a really established area. In fact, I was employed as a reporter when I was for Only Sky as a secular media organisation to look into this movement, this growing movement. So if you're going to accuse me of making up the term myself for some kind of political agenda I have or anti-religious agenda I have, is absolutely not the case. I'm talking, in fact, what I was referring to research that was done, empirical data, to look at the connection between Christian nationalists and those who support Putin. Anyway, I would argue that Mike Johnson is one of these people, but I think it's nothing to do with why he's deciding what he's deciding at the moment. What he is deciding is based solely on his own job as speaker being under threat. Now, I talked yesterday in that same piece on the Washington Post report that Trump is wanting to end the war by getting peace in 24 hours and forcing them both to the negotiating table, etc., etc. And that part of that was ceding territory to Russia. And now it's really interesting this because Trump's come out and said that that is fake news. That he said, quote, "This is all fake news from the Washington Post. They're just making it up. President Trump is the only one talking about stopping the killing. Joe Biden is talking about more killings." Just in that statement, he has confirmed exactly what the Washington Post said, right? But he doesn't realize it because I don't think he's clever enough. So the idea is that he's going to force them to the negotiating table. He's not going to give aid to Ukraine, which means they're forced to the table, and then they'll have to do a deal, which will necessarily mean, if they can't fight anymore, that they will have to give Russia something that Russia needs, which is the territory, so Crimea, Donbass, etc., etc. That's the only way you understand getting them to stop. The only other option is giving them money to continue the war so that they don't cede that territory. So when he says Joe Biden just wants to carry on the killing, what he's saying is Joe Biden wants to continue supporting Ukraine and giving them aid. I don't want to support the killing, so I'm not going to give them aid, which will force them to the table, which will, by extension, force them to lose that territory. So that's exactly what the Washington Post stated, and it's exactly what Trump's position is. And so he is, by denying the Washington Post article as being and calling it fake news, he is indeed confirmed exactly what it said, and it's true news. So Trump will not approve the details of the peace plan he has until he is in power. How convenient, and can properly weigh all the options, he said. He's already said in public interviews before exactly what his position is. Well, as in, he will solve it within 24 hours, and that will likely involve ceding territory. Well, not likely, it will involve, if you piece together different interviews he's done. Anyway, talking about like how these ideas find their purchase in different societies, like for example the United States, and why certain Republicans appear to be anti-Ukraine and pro-Putin, we're going to go to Disinformation again. So this is a Swedish outlet that has done a little useful piece here with infographics on how pro-Russian disinformation is laundered. Thank you for whoever sent this to me. Can't quite remember, someone on Twitter. So let's look at this. A Russian-linked influence campaign designed to stop the West's support to Ukraine is in motion. SVT, so that's the Swedish media organization's verification team, has gone through hundreds of newspaper articles and posts on social media to reveal the Russian methods. Pro-Russian disinformation is systematically planted and laundered. This is interesting, so you don't know where it's come from before it reaches us in the West. Follow the path of lies step by step. So it says planting the light, and it follows this one example. December the 21st, it starts with a video clip published by an anonymous YouTube account. A man claims that his brother, an Egyptian journalist, has been murdered by Ukrainian special forces after exposing how Zelensky's mother-in-law bought a luxury villa in Egypt. The story of the luxury villa began spreading as early as August, also by a YouTube account with a false identity. SVT was able to reveal at that time that it was indeed false. So I don't know if you remember this. I remember some of these claims and whatnot. Okay, and then next you have step 2. The story is picked up by the Egyptian media. The story is next published by 3 Egyptian newspapers. 2 of them have previously spread fake news from the same influence campaign several times before. So these are known media outlets that are receptive to this this YouTube channel and therefore Russian disinformation. So it falls on fertile ground for them and then picks up another Egyptian media source, and then that goes into wider society. So this is what we see. And then we have December the 23rd. So only 2 days later, the false news is published in English. Now the first English language site picks up the story. Clearstory.news gives the impression of being an American news site, but SVT can connect the domain to a Russian IP address. The IP address can in turn be linked to other domains. One of them is DC Weekly, which, like Clearstory, spreads Russian disinformation in English. Behind the sites is a pro-Russian American Mark Dugan. Step number 4, and this is how it spreads. So insidious, nefarious. December the 25th, so 1 day later from that. Now, as the story has been laundered through several channels, Russian media begin reporting on the journalist's murder. At the same time, the story reaches an audience in the West via social media. So then the Russians, of course they know this, but they pick it up as Egyptian media or English language media reporting on those Egyptian stories, which they had initially planted, and it comes full circle. And then, well, we can report this as like proper news now, say the Russian media outlets, and it's also going wildfire through social media that we know from empirical data that spreads fake news 6 times quicker than true news, and that's a massive challenge. And the big pattern, while our example is just one of many, researchers at Clemson University in the United States have been able to document 12 other false news stories that follow the same pattern, but in reality there are many, many more. In all cases, false testimonies are planted on social media and then systematically spread by African newspapers and a Russian-linked English language site before reaching the rest of the world. The goal is for the lies not to be traceable back to Russia. And so this is why it's so important to find the original source here being an anonymous YouTube channel. So it's very difficult to find out the actual provenance of the original story when they are anonymized online. Now, then transfer this across to the US. So Washington Post has released a very interesting article that is Russian trolls target US support for Ukraine according to Kremlin documents, right? So when President Biden proposed an additional $24 billion in supplemental funding for Ukraine in August, Moscow spin doctors working for the Kremlin were ready to try to undermine public support for the bill. Internal Kremlin documents show. And in ongoing campaign that seeks to influence congressional and other political debates to stoke anti-Ukraine sentiment, Kremlin-linked political strategists and trolls have written thousands of fabricated news articles, social media posts and comments that promote American isolationism, stir fear over the United States border security, and attempt to amplify US economic and racial tensions, according to the trove of internal Kremlin documents obtained by European Intelligence Service and reviewed by the Washington Post. This is fascinating and really deeply worrying. And what you get then is, I talked about this recently, whereby people like Marjorie Taylor Greene might end up getting to the election in November 2024 and realise that all those people who are singing her praises online under her Twitter tweets aren't actually real people, that they're trolls back in America and they don't get a vote. So it'll be interesting to see what actual American people think, because the worry is that at least some of the people in America are being influenced by the sheer volume of false information that's out there, that's been put out there in the same way that we just looked at with the Swedish findings. And then they then also feed into political, lawmakers' views on how things are. And then that feeds into votes in Congress. One of the political strategists, and the question is, what the hell are we doing about this? Like, yeah, I'm reporting on this, but what's the US government doing about this? What are social media organizations like Twitter, like Facebook and YouTube doing to combat this disinformation? And yes, it will take regulation. Yes, it will take action of these social media. You can't just sit back and go, freedom of speech. Go for it, guys. Spread disinformation, fool people into making insane decisions in the corridors of political power. But it's fine because freedom of speech. It's fine that they're acting on lies that have been planted by a state actor that is our enemy. That's fine because they should have the freedom of speech. Just as they had the freedom of movement to move into our country with tanks. Yeah, and just because they've got the right to bear arms. Oh dear, we've been invaded. Oh dear, I'm in a gulag. Oh dear, freedom of speech. Oh, I've no longer got freedom of speech. Oh, and we're back to what's called the paradox of intolerance. The more you allow stuff to happen freely, I tolerate all of that. Freedom of speech, I'm a freedom of speech absolutist. I tolerate everything. You'll get to a stage where that tolerance of intolerance means that those intolerant actors end up consuming you. And your tolerance is taken advantage of. So even with freedom of speech, you need to have a point where you don't accept certain things, because otherwise you will eventually get taken advantage of. So as a free speech absolutist, imagine someone like Elon Musk says, I allow anything on my platforms, allows like fascism, Nazism to spread. That it spreads so much that it becomes a prevailing thought, and then people then start voting for fascists, right? And then they then take control, and then they shut down Twitter or take control of Twitter, and so it can only say what they dictate it can say. And so the freedom of speech idea, if you allow it to be complete and utter freedom of speech, is able to be taken advantage of by the intolerant to then consume that freedom of speech platform to become a platform that is dictated to. Paradox of intolerance. One of the political strategists, for instance, instructed a troll farm employee working for his firm to write a comment of, quote, no more than 200 characters in the name of a resident of a suburb of a major city. The strategist suggested that this fictitious American, quote, doesn't support the military aid that the US has given to Ukraine and considers that the money should be spent defending America's borders and not Ukraine's. He sees that Biden's policies are leading the US toward collapse, close quote. This is from a Russian document. And I have heard these things said to me by people in my threads. And some of you saying that aren't Russian trolls. You are American people that are saying, I had an argument yesterday saying, well, if Biden just signed H2, then, you know, if the border was just closed, then we would get Ukraine aid. I support Ukraine aid, but we need to secure our borders first before we do Ukraine. Those two things are not connected. You do not need, it's not contingent. Ukraine aid is not contingent on border reform. It's false to spank those two together. Right? That is false. They are separate items, because in the same way you say we can't have extra money spent on education until we sort out border. What? Yes, we can. We can walk and chew gum. Those two things are not connected. Yeah, but we can't control insulin price of insulin until we sort out the border. Yes, you can. Why are you connecting those two? So why is it that only Ukraine aid is connected to the border? You are listening to ideas that are amplified by Russia, and it ain't cool. The documents, numbering more than 100 and dating between May 2022 and August 2023, were provided to the Post to expose Kremlin propaganda operations aimed at undermining support for Ukraine in the US, as well as their scale and methods. The files are part of a series of leaks that allowed a rare glimpse into Moscow's parallel efforts to weaken support for Ukraine in France and Germany, as well as destabilize Ukraine itself. Russia has been ramping up its propaganda operations as part of a second front that current and former senior Western officials said has become almost as important for Moscow as the military operations in Ukraine. This is what I've been saying for so long, especially as congressional approval for further aid has become critical for Kyiv's ability to continue defending itself. I'm going to be reading more of this now because this is what I keep talking about. Quote, it is Russia's top priority to stop the weapons, so they're throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, said one Republican staffer on Capitol Hill. Quote, we are seeing a broad-based campaign that has multiple lines of effort, some of which work better than others. The Russians don't care, they're just trying to seed the environment, the staffer and other Western officials spoke on the condition of anonymity. Campaign has attempted to paint Ukrainian President Zelensky as corrupt, emphasised the numbers of migrants crossing the US-Mexico border, called for border security to be funded over any aid to Ukraine, and described, quote, white Americans as the principal losers because of foreign aid, the documents show. So whether you believe that's true or not, this is what the Russians are shouting about, and we have documents that supposedly from the Kremlin that show this. The strategy promotes views on the far right wing of the Republican Party and calls for some of the messaging to be voiced by American, quote, public opinion leaders and politicians, one of the documents shows, but it does not name any people who could be enlisted to do that. Many of the documents contain metadata showing they were written by members of the team working for Ilya Gambashidze, head of the Moscow PR firm Social Design Agency. The US imposed sanctions on him last month for his involvement in a, quote, persistent foreign malign influence campaign at the Kremlin's direction. including the creation of websites designed to impersonate legitimate media outlets in Europe, part of a campaign that Western officials have called Doppelganger. Neither he nor Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov have responded for a comment. So it's an increasingly sophisticated strategy that is built on nearly 10 years of Kremlin efforts to elevate the voices of populist and anti-establishment politicians opposed to the US global role, analysts and former American officials said, with the far right wing of the Republican Party essentially blocking passage of any further assistance to Ukraine since August. The Kremlin's efforts to undermine support for Ukraine have so far gained more traction in the US than anywhere else. Quote, the impact of the Russian program over the last decade is seen in the US congressional debate over Ukraine aid, said Clint Watts, the head of Microsoft's Threat Analysis Center. So even Microsoft are like confirming this. They have had an impact in a strategic aggregate way. You would never have previously heard politicians in the US saying Ukraine is not significant enough that we will not support NATO. On a digital platform, your ability to do these things works. Representative and Republican from Ohio, Michael Turner, who chairs the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, said on Sunday, and this is what he said. Let's listen to him. So the chairman of the House US Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, believes that the Russian propaganda has penetrated the walls of the US legislature as members of the US Congress are spreading false information about the Russian invasion. He believes his own colleagues, his own party is threatened here. And this is a massive, massive worry. And here we have Turner speaking to Jake Tapper.
Let's turn to Ukraine, an issue that's important to you and your fellow Republican chairman, Michael McCaul, who runs the Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman McCaul made a comment this week about what he says sounds like Russian propaganda from some conservative media, and why it's so difficult to explain to Republican voters why supporting Ukraine is important. He told Julia Yaffe, quote, I think Russian propaganda has made its way into the United States, unfortunately, and it's infected a good chunk of my party's base. He singled out primetime shows on conservative channels. Do you agree with him, and how big is this problem?
Oh, it is absolutely true. We see directly coming from Russia attempts to mask communications that are anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia messages, some of which we even hear being uttered on the House floor. I mean, there are members of Congress today who still incorrectly say that this conflict between Russia and Ukraine is over NATO, which of course it is not. Vladimir Putin having made it very clear, both publicly and to his own population, that his view is that this is a conflict of a much broader claim of Russia to Eastern Europe, and including claiming all of Ukraine territory as Russia's. Now, to the extent that this propaganda takes hold, it makes it more difficult for us to really see this as an authoritarian versus democracy battle, which is what it is. President Xi of China, Vladimir Putin himself have identified it as such. We need to stand up for democracy. We need to make certain that we know that authoritarian regimes never stop when they start an aggression. Ukraine needs our help and assistance now, and this is a very critical time for the U.S. Congress to step up and provide that aid.
Really fascinating stuff, and so important that he is calling out, and Michael McCaul, that this disinformation is finding its way to the Congress floor with politicians who are saying this, who are spreading that disinformation continually. There's so much in this article, lots more that I could talk about. It talks about all the elements of interference in the 2016 election, with the Russians getting involved there, and then just pushing this content every day. It's just relentless. And the question is always, what are we doing about this? Why are we not fighting back in a much more concerted way? I don't know. But anyway, well worth looking at that Washington Post article. We'll just go quickly on though, because I know I've been spending far too long on some of these topics. Right. As far as the discharge petition that we've talked about previously, the one that started by the Republicans, here's a list of Republican lawmakers. Started by the Democrats. The Republican one is kind of dead in the water. But the Democrat one has a chance of being passed if a number of Republicans cross the aisle. Here are the Democrats who haven't voted on it, and some who might be able to be convinced. Please contact them via Twitter, via email, and that'd be fantastic. Possibly the discharge petition might work. Now, here is what happens when you have successful disinformation that gets into the head of voters. And this is exactly the type of voter I was talking about when I did my Christian nationalist piece yesterday. This here is someone who has a greater affinity for Putin based on his traditional values than she does for her own American politicians.
If Vladimir Putin were running against Joe Biden for president, who would you vote for?
For our country? That's a hard question. Probably Putin.
It is?
Yeah, I don't think Putin's as bad as people want to.
You would vote for Vladimir Putin?
I would. Over Biden? Hell yeah.
You would vote for Vladimir Putin for president of the United States?
Putin wants to go back to good morality. He doesn't allow
traditional values.
If
Notice she's got a t-shirt with Tucker Carlson and stop liberal intolerance, as if the liberals are intolerant, but she's not intolerant herself, yet she wants a dictator to be. She'd rather vote for a dictator than Biden, who's actually pretty inclusive and the country's doing pretty well, actually, all things considered. You know, economically, socially, yeah, you might complain about stuff going on the border, but generally speaking, US is doing fairly well, and yet, you know, stop liberal intolerance. Anyway, the fact that she would advocate voting for Putin based on the idea she has of him in terms of his, championing traditional values, rather than the fact that he's committed war crimes or ordered an invasion of another country that involves systematic war crimes, it blows my mind. And Putin has wheeled out Alexander Dugin, his favourite philosopher, to say Jerusalem will be a Russian city or it will not exist at all, because Russia has no borders, and that includes apparently Israel. Russian embassy in Vilnius was pelted with Molotov cocktails twice over the weekend. So the Baltics, not a big fan of the Russians at the moment. And I love the fact that I think it's here they changed the road to Heroes of Ukraine Street, which is where the Russian embassy is. So whenever they write the address of their embassy, they had to put Heroes of Ukraine Street, one would presume. Right, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has landed in China to speak to Wang Li, the Chinese foreign minister, and they're going to talk about Ukraine war, bilateral cooperation, of course, all the ways that China can support Ukraine in the war. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said, if you assist in enhancing Russia's military power, the United States will take action against you, speaking to Chinese banks and exporters. I emphasized that companies, including those in China, should not provide material support to Russia's war, and that they will face significant consequences if they do, and I hope they do suffer those consequences. And finally, European defense contractors have warned that dependence on Chinese cotton, which is used in munitions powder, is threatening their ability to expand production. There's also the shortage of nitrocellulose. So in wanting to ramp up military production within Europe, there's still this, we live in a global marketplace where there are components that we need from countries that are not cool in terms of the war in Ukraine. And so there are challenges to overcome in getting hold of those raw materials to make those munitions. Anyway, that's enough from me. It's been a long one today. I could have spent even long on that disinformation article in the Washington Post. Very good one it was. I know we sometimes slag off Washington Post and other outlets for being not reporting this war particularly well, but that is a very good article, and it's bang on what I've been talking about so much. The effect of the successful Russian disinformation campaigns inside our minds, inside our politics, inside our countries, inside our institutions. We need to do something about it. Take care. Speak soon.